It is often said by mainstream modern scholarship that Kemet, ancient Egypt, is not culturally related to the rest of Africa, or more specifically in the case of this video, to West Africa. In the first part of this series, we saw how all these African regions share a common ancestry in the Green Sahara region and the Horn of Africa, and how they have always interacted with one another, with genes flowing from one region of the continent to another for as long as we can remember. And these interactions, contrary to what certain dishonest scholars would have you believe, did not only happen because of slavery. For you see, the Western scholar of the imperial times had created a myth that consisted of relegating all black presence in the ancient world to slavery. But that was only what it was. A bloody myth, quite literally. We already know from the first part of this series that our black African ancestors migrated and settled all over the continent on their own free will. I would advise you watch that part first before watching this one for a better understanding of what we are talking about. So our African ancestors migrated for various reasons, not just because they were enslaved and taken by force to another region. They migrated for trade, environmental issues, curiosity, exploration, want of conquest, want of better land, want of more land, want of trade routes, etc. Just like any other human group on this planet. But somehow the Western and Arab scholars can't believe that the so-called quote-unquote sub-Saharan Africans migrated north to the Nile Valley on their own free will. Yet they have no hard time believing that Eurasians migrated towards the Nile Valley on their own free will. I wonder why they think this way. Do the so-called sub-Saharan Africans lack legs to migrate north? Do they lack the will to explore like other humans? Do they lack the curiosity found in other human beings? You see where I'm going with this? Obviously, the answer to all these questions is no. And if you said yes to all these questions, well, we have no hope for you. You're one of those people. Some will say that it is the Sahara Desert that acts as a natural barrier to the African people south of the Sahara. A bloody lie. First of all, we've seen in the previous video that the Sahara was not always a desert. And a quick look at the map of Africa will let you know the falsehood of the Sahara being an impregnable barrier. It is so obviously wrong that even a 5-year-old could figure out by looking at a map the way to get to the Nile Valley from any point of the continent. So please, we're not fooled by that obvious lie. From East Africa to the Nile Valley, from the Nile Valley to West Africa, from West Africa to Central Africa, from Central Africa to Southern Africa, from East Africa to North Africa, and so on, our ancestors' migratory routes shows that we are all related on the African continent, and this is supported by archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. Now the question is, are we related culturally? Is the Nile Valley related culturally to West Africa, for example? Well, that is the question this series aims to answer. This video series will show you that Kemet is indeed culturally related to the rest of the African continent south of the Sahara. And in this video, we start with a demonstration of the cultural link between Kemet and West Africa. Well, why Kemet only? What about Kush? Because they recognize that Kush is related to other African civilizations, but they don't recognize that Kemet is, hence the focus of the video. But of course, what applies to Kemet applies to Kush, because they were the same people, the same civilization. Look at these people, they were brothers. They were the same people, same religion, same culture, same way of dressing, same way of ruling themselves. There is not even denying the brotherhood, the kinship between Kush and Kemet. Anyhow, so in this video we focus on Kemet and West Africa, and in order to clearly understand this cultural link, we need to understand what culture is, what the items that constitutes culture in a society are, and lastly, what are some of the cultural items that constitute as evidence for a cultural link between two or more peoples. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. Disclaimer: again, this video focuses on West Africa, as I have mentioned. Don't come at me in the comment section saying, but the East Africans, calm down, we're gonna get there in the next episode, one thing at a time. Also, I am aware that West Africa is a diverse place with many civilizations over history over time. However, this way of grouping them is useful since they are very closely related, that is culturally, linguistically, and genetically. So that is why I am grouping them like this. However, we will go into specific civilizations in later videos. So with that said, let's roll the intro. Now that's quite the lengthy intro, isn't it? So, first, let's define culture. What is culture? According to Edward Tyler, an English anthropologist, Culture is an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, art, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. This is quite the useful definition. Now we know what to look at when doing the cross-cultural comparisons between Nile Valley cultures and those of Africans further south. Things such as social institutions, behavior, knowledge, beliefs will help us navigate this analysis, which will demonstrate the common cultural background of all these African peoples. Now we first need to remember this very important piece of information from the last video. That is, the ancestors of most African peoples shared a common culture in the Green Sahara era, and this for millennia. This happened specifically in the central region of the Green Sahara. This is well supported by archaeology, linguistics, and even genetics. I refer you to part 1 of this series for the long list of evidence supporting this. Funny how the so-called Great Barrier of Separation is the very one that proves our strong link. Quite ironical. The separation between West Africa and the Nile Valley occurred only during the drying up of the Sahara, turning it into a desert, around the beginning of Kemet's pre-dynastic period. This is more so in the case of West Africans, but not for East Africans, since East Africans were not really affected by this due to the Nile River being an obvious migratory route up and down Northeast and Southeast Africa. But even after this separation, migrations from west to east must still have happened because, traveling is a thing. Migration, people. Migration. People have feet, so they walk and they go places because they have brains that are always wondering what's out there. This idea that West Africans originated in West Africa only and stayed stuck there for millennia is an ignorant statement. It disregards the history of migration in the region, the archaeology done on the region, the genetic studies done on the region, and really it disregards human nature. I demonstrated in part 1 how the ancestors of the current West Africans are the result of agriculturalist groups that came from East and Northeast Africa, that is the Nile Valley and the Horn. These agriculturalist groups that came from the East admixed with the local pygmy populations or Twa populations that moved from the central Sahara region around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago when it became a desert and settled the West African plains and forests. This admixture between these two peoples occurred around 2000 to 1000 BC, so around 3 to 4,000 years ago. These same pygmy or Twa people of West Africa once interacted with Nilo-Saharan pastoralists in the central region of the Green Sahara. This occurred around 6 to 8,000 years ago. That is the encounter between Nilo-Saharans and the Pygmies. Follow! Just kidding. And again, guys, this is well supported by archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, as I showed in the previous video. Watch part 1 of this series from minute 35 to minute 47 to get all the information you need on this. And also, I urge you to check part 1's description for the studies supporting my statements. Alright, so these are the two major events that show a clear interaction between the Nile Valley and West Africa. Now, why are these important for our current video? Well, because many of the cultural items that can be found in both West Africa and the Nile Valley can only be explained by these two major events. That is, the earlier interactions in the central Green Sahara, then later on the migrations of Nile Valley peoples further south into West, Central, and Southern East Africa, and also the environment, since culture is partly influenced by the environment. Think about it. Both West Africans and Nile Valley peoples, such as the Cushites and the Kemites, are both tropical Africans, meaning they both have so-called kinky hair texture that I like to call tropical hair texture or frizzy hair texture. They both have what we call today black skin and higher limb proportions. So this also influences the way people innovate in their culture. For instance, in clothing, both Kemites, Cushites, and West Africans, for example, being tropical Africans, barely cover their torso, and in most cases, they simply did not cover their torsos at all. Why were they doing this? Because they both have very high amounts of melanin in their skin, so the sun does not negatively affect their skin, unlike melanin deficient people such as most Eurasians. Hence, they only cover the lower part of their body, unlike the pale-skinned Levantine people or Turkish people or the vast majority of Arabs. That's just one example. We'll later see many more. Now, in this discussion, we also need to distinguish between cultural items that have survived the split of a people that were once of the same culture and cultural items that occurred through various mechanisms of cultural diffusion.
Cultural diffusion? What the hell is that?
Don't worry, I'll explain. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural items, such as ideas, styles, religions, technologies, languages, between individuals, whether within a single culture or from one culture to another. It is distinct from the diffusion of innovations within a specific culture. Examples of cultural diffusion include the spread of the war chariot and iron smelting in ancient times, and the use of automobiles and Western business suits in the 20th century. Now, there are different types of cultural diffusions, namely expansion diffusion, relocation diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, contagious diffusion, and stimulus diffusion. These diffusions can occur in three different mechanisms, which are direct diffusion, which occurs when two cultures are very close to each other, resulting in intermarriage, trade, and even warfare. An example would be between the United States and Canada, where people living on the border of these two countries engage in hockey, which started in Canada, and baseball, which is popular in the United States. Then we have forced diffusion, which occurs when one culture subjugates, conquers, or enslaves another culture and forces its own customs and habits on the conquered people. An example would be the forced Christianization of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, by the Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese, or the forced Islamization of West Africa by the Fula people. Then we have indirect diffusion, which happens when traits are passed from one culture through a middleman to another culture, without the first and final cultures being in direct contact. An example could be the presence of Mexican food in Canada, since a large territory, the United States, lies in between. Did you follow here? Feel free to go back and make sure you get the concepts, because I would do that too. I myself had to go back many times to read it and be like, okay, I get it now. Anyhow, bear in mind that diffusions can occur back and forth between cultures. So what the anthropologists have observed is that we find in other African cultures further south many cultural elements that are also common in the Nile Valley. This can only be explained through the fact that they were both of the same culture and later split to go different ways, and the fact that these cultural elements are still present in spite of the geographical distance and time that separates these peoples only strengthens the argument. Because think about it, it means the people have spent so much time in the same geographical area and shared the same culture for so long that even after a long separation, they still practice the same things. This could have not happened if they hadn't spent much time together in the same culture. And the thing is, we have tangible scientific evidence of this long time they spent together in the same area as one people or many peoples that are closely related in the same geographical area. Hence, direct cultural diffusion must have occurred heavily, or maybe even forced cultural diffusion and indirect, all three. So, we can now go back to our first major event I name the central region of the Green Sahara era. As I explained earlier in this video, the ancestors of the West Africans and of the Nile Valley people are proven to have interacted for millennia in the central region of the Green Sahara, from about 8000 BC to 6 or 5000 BC. That's about 3 millennia. That is a long period of time of interaction, and during this long period, various mechanisms of cultural diffusion must have occurred. This is evidenced even in the archaeology, as stated in a study by Ditka Sukopova 2015, linked in the description of course. These hunter-gatherers might have adopted the pastoral economy from their neighbors, but some groups of hunters certainly abandoned the Central Sahara. Also, the ancestors of the West Africans seem to have passed on the knowledge of ceramic technology to their East African Nilo-Saharan brothers. This is also the place where the Nilo-Saharans may have been introduced to the idea of agriculture, since it is said in the archaeological records that the people in the central Green Sahara may have practiced some form of wild grain economy and a form of proto-agriculture. There you go. Clear evidence and clear examples of cultural diffusion by direct contact, since they once shared a common geographical area in the Central Sahara. This means trade, marriages, and possibly wars must have occurred between our ancestors there, and most likely conquests, which leads to people becoming one. Basically what was happening in pre-colonial times in the central region of Africa or even in West Africa, and we can see what this led to. So many cultures in Central Africa are very similar. They are even spoken of as one culture, the Bantu people. Yes, anyhow. And let's remember that these people lived in the same environment too, meaning they were both influenced by the same climate conditions, the same fauna, and the same environmental pressures. Why am I mentioning this? Because culture is partly influenced by our environment. These will explain the similitudes that we will later visually observe between Nile Valley peoples and West Africans, since it is now scientifically proven that they were once part of the same culture in the Central Sahara. Certain of the similitudes are clearly the result of survived cultural items after the split of a people. Now, the next major event are the migrations from East and Northeast Africa around 2 to 1000 BC. Here too, we have clear evidence of cultural diffusion, the introduction of a better form of agriculture and other knowledge, beliefs, and items. Here, relocation diffusion must have occurred, meaning a people relocates somewhere and brings their culture and cultural innovations with them, and then they mix in with the cultural innovations of the local people. Many of the cultural elements found in West Africa can be explained through this factor too, and also through the effect of survived cultural items after the split of a people. Because remember, it's not every Kemite that went at the same time to West Africa. Come on, that's quite a dumb way to think about it. It's usually maybe like one faction decided to quit, so that's a split between the people of the Nile Valley, and then they split, they went to West Africa, and then those cultural items must have survived, and they probably also went like,
hey, you quite like us, the way you do things.
And so they recognized their culture within the others. Because remember, the Kemites were like, our ancestors, our gods are from the land of Punt. The land of gods is within Africa. They did not regard Eurasia as an ancestral home, as the land of gods. No, it was inner Africa that they regarded this way. Anyhow, that was a tangent. Now, one thing I would like to get out of the way is the claim that Kemites came from the Levant. We already saw in the historical records that this is not supported by any archaeological, linguistic, and even genetic evidence. Well, let me tell you that anthropology supports this even less. Why? Because if the Kemites were indeed from the so-called Near East or the Levant or Mesopotamia, as some like to claim, we would expect to see elements that would have survived the split of these peoples. Things such as social institutions, clothing style, religious ideas, hairdos, etc. Things that a migrating population could easily keep. Yet, what we rather find in the Near East and the Nile Valley are cultural items that can only be explained through direct, indirect, or even forced cultural diffusion. Meaning, because of the existing trade between these peoples, a few cultural items must have been exchanged back and forth between these cultures. Almost nothing suggests that they were once part of the same culture. Also, to say that they were once part of the same culture, we have to invent archaeological data and make up a linguistic link that isn't there between the Levant and the Nile Valley. And don't get me started on Semitic. The Semitic origin of the Kemetic language has been debunked long ago. To believe a Semitic origin, one has to create archaeological data out of thin air. Hardly anything we can scientifically do. Therefore, we go where the evidence points to, that is, Africa further south. Also, feel free to check a video on the origin of the Kemites I made. I would recommend the True History of Ancient Egypt from my channel and my video on the Nakata culture. Links in the description. Alright. Now let me give you the framework of this analysis before we proceed to showing the deep cultural connections West Africa shares with the Nile Valley. Our framework is based on the definition of culture itself. Remember, we define culture as an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits. Hence, our presentation will show the similarities point by point in social institutions, then social norms, beliefs, and customs, then art and crafts, then capabilities. These 4 points will include the various items that were mentioned in the definition of culture. So we start with social institutions. And before we start, guys, a little disclaimer. Bear in mind that I cannot go into details and mention every West African civilization that has ever existed. None of us wants the video to be 5 hours or 10 hours. So if I don't mention certain things that you may know, feel free to share them in the comment section. This is a collective effort, not an individualistic one. So please share whatever cultural connections you saw in your culture, especially West Africans. Come on, be present in the comment section. Yes, so share every cultural connections that you may have noticed, and please share a source or please explain clearly your point of view so that people understand or can confirm what you're saying. And stay civil. Thank you. So with that said, let's begin. 1. Social institutions. First, we need to define what a social institution is. Yes, I know we got a lot of definitions here, but definitions are important for a better understanding of things. So, what is a social institution? A social institution is a group or organization that has specific roles, norms, and expectations which functions to meet the social needs of a society. The family, the government, religion, education, the media are all examples of social institutions. But in this segment, we are only going to focus on the government and religion because those are the two areas which we have the most information on about the ancient world. Alright, we start with the government. Here the similarities between Nile Valley civilizations and their West African counterparts are pretty telling. It's revealing. Let me use that word. In both Kemet, Kush, and West Africa in general, the king was considered divine. This is the idea of divine kingship that so many anthropologists have noticed in both Kemet, Kush, and other African civilizations, further south of course. This is what the American Egyptologist Stuart Tyson Smith and many others have pointed out. Their conclusions corroborate the earlier observations of the great African anthropologist and Egyptologist Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. This clearly shows that they were part of the same culture, meaning they were once the same people. But this is only the beginning. The burial practices found in West Africa and Kemet will further convince you. For instance, it is customary for the Yoruba people of current-day Nigeria and various other West African civilizations to bury their kings with their servants so that they could be served even in afterlife. For instance, the Nigerian scholar and historian J. Olumide Lucas informs us of the following. The burial customs of ancient Egypt and the Yoruba are also similar. Previous to burial, the corpse in Yoruba land is dressed like the Egyptian mummy. In the case of the burial of a king, the king's slaves must be buried with him, and his chief officers and wives must die on the day of burial. The idea underlying this custom is that the king would require services of his dependents, especially for manual work in the next world. Now, no one can say of them that they didn't have faith in their religion, eh? God damn, dying on the day your husband dies? Anyhow, this practice can be found all over the African continent, south of the Sahara. Dr. Olumide tells us in his book, The Religion of the Yorubas, that this practice of burying the king with his servants was also present in Kemet, at least in the early dynastic and pre-dynastic period, attesting to a cultural link between Kemet and Yoruba civilization. Well, Dr. Olumide is not wrong in his conclusion there, because here is what Egyptology has to tell us about early Kemite royal burial practices. The Italian archaeologist and Egyptologist Sergio Donadoni informs us in his book The Egyptians that the tombs of the early pharaohs of Kemet contained human sacrifices that were buried with their pharaoh. This is clearly the practice found in West Africa we have just mentioned, which obviously later got abandoned by the Kemites because it was so brutal. Hence, in later Kemite tombs, we only find human figurines that serve as a representation of afterlife servants of the king, a watered-down version of the old practice. This shows that this is a cultural item that must have survived the split of these peoples back in the Green Sahara, since the practice stopped in Kemet and Kush, but could still be found very recently in most parts of West, Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa, up until the day of colonization actually. Can we find this practice in, say, Mesopotamia, where the culture of Kemites supposedly came from? No, the Mesopotamians did not practice divine kingship. They did not believe their king was a god on earth, let alone bury their kings along with their servants prior to the Kemites. And also, the tombs in Mesopotamia, where they find other bodies, are assumed to be servants, but some scholars disagree because they think that it was just bodies that were dumped there later on, and not coming from a practice of letting the king be served in afterlife. At least, the scholars don't say that about Mesopotamia. Now, onto the political organization. Now, on the political organization of the Society of the Kemites and West Africans, we find here again a great deal of similarity. Here I am just going to quote directly from the book of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, The African Origin of Civilization. Social organization. The social stratification of African life is precisely that of Egypt. In Egypt, the stratification was as follows: peasants, skilled workers, priests, warriors, and government officials, the king. In the rest of Black Africa, we have peasants, artisans or skilled workers, warriors and priests, the king. See, it is identical. These people understood society in the exact same way. This is again clear evidence of a common cultural background. In Mesopotamia, the hypothetical source of Kemite culture, LOL, we do not have the same organization. We have the slaves, then the lower class, then the upper class, then the priests and nobles, then the king.
Uh-oh, it got a little different. It got a little different for me. Maybe not anybody else.
It's quite different, don't you think? Anyhow, another similarity between Kemet and West Africa is the ritual of murdering a king when he was not fit to rule. In Kemet, the said festival, known as the Rejuvenation Festival of the Pharaoh, originates from this older, brutal ritual of killing the Pharaoh when he became unfit to rule.
That was legitness.
Yeah, it was.
Oh my God!
As the scholar Cottrell Leonard informs us in his book The Lost Pharaohs, page 71. This is most likely why we don't know many Kemite Nesut or pharaohs of the early dynasties. Anyhow, this practice of killing the monarch, should he be unfit to rule, was also found in the following civilizations of West Africa. We found it in the Yoruba civilization, the Hausa, the Dagomba, the Igala, just to give a few examples. Jealous people will say we're making these up. Great. This shows that this cultural practice clearly survived the split from the Green Sahara again. If you want to read further on this aspect of kingship, check out the book The African Origin of Civilization by Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, page 138. Speaking of kingship, the symbols of kingship in Kemet and West Africa are also the same. Did you know that? In West Africa and Southern Africa in general, the mace head and the fly swatter are symbols of kingship. Well, this was the case in Kemet as well. The first Nesut of Kemet, the first pharaoh of Kemet, was holding a fly swatter and a mace head. The YouTube channel Mr. Imhotep made a great video on this subject. Link in the description. Go check out his video. Now we move on to religion. And here, guys, there isn't even a debate when you look at the religious practices of the Nile Valley people and their West African brothers. The debate is so hard to keep up that Egyptology had to recognize the following, and I quote, "Archaeological data has suggested that the Egyptian religious system had close cultural affinities with Eastern African populations and arose from an African substratum rather than deriving from the Mesopotamian or Mediterranean regions." Say what now? East Africa? Can't wait to get there in the next part. And expose the very African nature of Kemet even more. This quote is from Egyptian Religion in Micropedia, Vol 6, Encyclopedia Britannica, 1984. So they know this. They have known this for a long time. Dr. Obenga was right during the Cairo Symposium. He told them, according to his investigation in linguistics and culture and anthropology by Dr. Diop, that Kemet was part of an African substratum. They agreed, but they said, well, that doesn't mean they were the same people. Dude, how are you part of the same substratum if you were not once connected in one area? Anyway, that's why UNESCO gave them the win of the debate in 1974. And since, they haven't organized another one. Alright, this was already pointed out by Dr. Diop and Theophile Obenga in 1974 during the Cairo Symposium, as I stated earlier. Then their brilliant observation was later supported in 1978 by the Dutch Egyptologist Frankfurt Henry, then in 2018 by the American Egyptologist Stuart Tyson Smith, then again in 2022 by the Italian Egyptologist Andrea Manzo. So the peer review system of the scientific method is in for the support. That's great. After so many years, they still can't prove. They still cannot show the Mesopotamian nature or Levantine nature or Mediterranean nature of Kemite civilization, of Kemite religion and culture. Anyhow, but I need to show you guys why these conclusions were reached by our scholars, and for this I will use the following religions: Akan traditional religion, Yoruba traditional religion, and Serer religious ideas. Through this comparison, you will see the very strong similarities between Nile Valley civilization and those of West Africa. Let's go. In Kemet and Kush, we have the supreme being that transcends all and from which all comes from. The originator of creation was Amon or Amon-Ra when the Kushites introduced Amen to the Kemites, who were worshipping the supreme being Ra, and they combined him in Amen-Ra, who is the Neter. Then we have the so-called lesser gods, which are often other manifestations of the Neter, the supreme being, deified aspects of society, nature, and life, and deified ancestors. These were known as the Neteru. Well, this is quite identical to West Africa. In Yoruba land, for instance, we have the supreme being, from which all originates, the creator. This being is known as Olodumare. Then we have the Orisha, the quote-unquote lesser gods, who are also other manifestations of Olodumare, deified aspects of society, society, nature and life, and deified ancestors. For instance, the Orisha Shango, my favorite Orisha because it's just so cool, is a deified ancestor who was most likely a great king of the Oyo people, who ruled during the invention of iron smelting or greatly invested in the artisans of the craft. Shango is also known as the Thor of Africa. He could wield lightning. Where is our cartoon on Shango? Guys, let's make one. I love cartoons. Anyhow, then we have Eshu, the Orisha of chance, who is the deification of an aspect of life, which we all know and have experienced, that is, luck, chance, fortune, right? Anyhow, just as in Kemet, Osiris was the deified ancestor of all the pharaohs along with his son Horus, while Montu is the deified god of war, an aspect of life. War, we all know this. Then in Akan land, it is pretty much the same. We have the supreme being known as Nyame or Nyakopon or Brikiri. Wow, Brikiri
Mission failed. We'll go next time.
Hey, what happened?
Well, the name you see on the screen, this one is hard to pronounce, which means the Almighty. This supreme being is also known as Odamankoma, Infinite Inventor, or again as Obade, the Creator, and Anansi Kokuroko, the Great Designer, or the Great Spider. Then we have the Abosum, the so-called Lesser Gods, who are again manifestations of the supreme being, deified aspects of society, nature and life, and deified ancestors. Then in Serer religion, we have the supreme being who is known as Rog. Then we have the Pangol, who are the Lesser Gods, who are again manifestations of the supreme being, deified aspects of society, life and nature, and deified ancestors. The same exact structure you find in Kemet. The Pangol, the Orisha, the Abosum are the exact same as the Neteru, and some aspects common throughout all these religions is the practice of ancestral worship and the embrace of many aspects of nature. The Kemites used to give offerings to deceased ancestors and ask them for protection and other favors. They believed the dead had power over the real world. This belief is identical to the rest of Africa, and in our particular case here, West Africa. However, this cannot be found in Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean region like the Levant. Nile Valley religion from Kemet and Kush was a typical traditional African religion. Another very telling piece of evidence is the fact that both the Akan and the Kemites practiced libation. I'm not kidding here. Here is some imagery of the practice from Kemet. Then we have some Akan doing the same, libation, pouring some water or drink, it could be alcohol or anything, to the ancestors. We give some offerings to our ancestors and the divinities for good favor. You see the respect our ancestors had for their ancestors? Where is that now? Please bring that back. Instead of believing, oh, it's witchcraft, don't do it. It's paying respect to your ancestors. It's not witchcraft. It is even believed by scholars that libation originated in Upper Kemet, then spread from there to the rest of Africa and the world. This spreads to the rest of Africa most likely occurred during our second major event, when some Kemites and Kushites moved from the Nile Valley during the attacks of the Eurasians. Another practice that has survived the split and shows the common cultural background of the Nile Valley and West Africa. There are so many other similarities, guys. Just check the comment section, you will see them, because there are many people who are smarter than I am and are way better read than I am. I know my audience. Some people here are very smart. So just check the comment section, you won't be disappointed. Also, guys, don't disappoint me, guys. Come on, smart people. It's crazy how this knowledge is there and they still deny the very African nature of Kemet. Even the Egyptologists, they should not even dare, because as an Egyptologist, you should be able to know all these cultural items. But because you don't know of any African cultural items, so you're like, well, Egypt is unique. Now, Kemet is African. Get that through your head and read about African history, about African culture, then you will notice it, like any rational, critical, and objective person has. Thank you. So yeah, Kemet was very African in nature. They had very traditional African practices. They were very traditional African people. Anyway, one other important piece of evidence are the burial practices of West Africa and the Nile Valley. First of all, we can clearly see that these two regions of Africa have the exact same belief in afterlife. They view afterlife in the exact same way, as we pointed out earlier with the king's burial, right? Like, they believed the king needed to be served in afterlife, so they believed he would live nicely in afterlife where he would need servants. And they also believed the ancestors in the afterlife can interact with our life, both the Kemites, the Kushites, and West Africans, and the rest of Africa. But what you don't know is that the Serer people of Senegal practiced mummification. I'm not kidding here. They practiced mummification, and what's more is that they buried their mummified bodies in pyramid-shaped tombs. I'm not even kidding here. That's crazy. That's a crazy similarity. And they will say, this is not a link. Did Mesopotamians practice mummification like the Kemites? Did they bury their deads in pyramid-shaped tombs? Well, some West African people did. Let's carry on. This, my friends, is clear evidence of a later movement of Nile Valley people into West Africa. Or the practice was already there in the Green Sahara, as evidenced by the Juan Mahuted mummy, aka the black mummy, as if most mummies weren't black. So yeah, it could have survived the splits of the Green Sahara, but I am more inclined to believe that the practice came later. Why? Because the Sahara people are the only ones in West Africa doing this. Anyhow, the Igbo people also used to bury their dead in stepped pyramids. I'm not kidding here again. The Tsunde pyramids found in Nigeria are very reminiscent of the stepped pyramid of Saqqara, built by the great black African genius Imhotep. Jealous people will say we're making these up again. The people from the Songhai Empire buried their kings, the Askias, in pyramids. Not kidding here again. This is the pyramid of Askia the Great. Look at it. This is a tomb in West Africa. These similarities cannot be found in Eurasia or the Mediterranean region except in Kemet. Another very telling piece of evidence is the practice of Heka in Kemet. What is Heka? According to the American Egyptologist James P. Allen, in his book Middle Egyptian, An Introduction to the Language and Culture of Hieroglyph, Heka is what we would call magic in English, but the term does not really fit. But when I give you an African term, you will understand what Heka is. Let's look at the definition. Heka in Kemet was the ability to make things happen by indirect means. Heka was believed to be a natural phenomenon, the force which was used to create the universe and which the gods employed to work their will. They also believed Heka could be used by humans for personal purposes. Though this could sometimes be in a harmful way, it was not seen as evil by nature. They primarily used it for overcoming or preventing negative events. For a Kemite to practice Heka, he had to go to a priest, who were the main practitioners of this magic. Now, have you already drawn the parallels? Does this really fit the magic term? This fits the term known as Juju in West Africa and Mchawi in East Africa. Yes, it be Juju, my friend. Shout out to the Nigerians out there. Juju, although believed to be an intrinsically evil practice today, in the days of our ancestors, it was not viewed this way. For our ancestors, Juju could be used to refer to magical properties dealing with good luck, but that's a Western definition. It was used to influence the forces of nature in your favor, to overcome or preventing negative events. To practice Juju, our ancestors had to go to a Marabu or Sangoma, or as we know them today, the witch doctors. A horrible misnomer. They were not witches. Anyway, a lot of people today conflate African religion or African religious ideas or African traditional religion with the practice of Juju. Not the same thing, guys. It's not the same thing. Juju is one thing and religion in Africa is another thing. And understanding Kemet just helped us understand that. I now get why Dr. Shekanta Diop wanted us to refer back to Kemet for a better understanding of African cultural practices. He was spot on that one. Anyhow, we have to move on from the religion, guys. There are so many similarities, as Dr. Shekanta Diop said in his book, The African Origin of Civilization, and I quote, Negro cosmogonies, African and Egyptian, resemble each other so closely that they are often complementary. To understand certain Egyptian concepts, one must refer to the black world, as is attested by what we have said about kingship. As is attested as well by what Kolimika just said a few minutes ago.
Look at this dude.
We understand the word Heka better when you replace it with the word Juju and not magic. Anyhow, the cosmogonies of the Kemites and West Africans are also pretty identical. They both exhibit the sexual duality of the creator god. It is neither male nor female, it is both. And this first mover or supreme being always creates male and female at the same time, not one out of the rib of the other as the Semites believed. In Africa, we believe in the equality and complementary nature of the male and the female. Each are equally of paramount importance to this life, which is a very rational biological observation, I might add. The African society was designed to never need a movement such as feminism, but today we do, because of so much influence from the exterior world. In most African cosmogonies, some straight up said the supreme being was a mother, but then when you go deeper, you're like, oh, it was androgynous. Then the first two beings they create to originate humanity in most African cosmogonies was a male and a female, both representing the moon and the sun. Anyhow, guys, do some further reading on this. Links in the description as usual. And all these These very important elements that can tell you whether a culture is linked to another or whether one culture and another have the same cultural background cannot be found in Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean region unless it has been transmitted to them by the Kemites, and this through direct or indirect cultural diffusion since they were so close geographically. And anthropology is clear on this. As you will see further, we will later show some examples of the spread of certain ideas from Kemet to the so-called Near East and Mediterranean region. Now let's move on to the next point. 2. Social beliefs, customs, and norms. We start with social beliefs. What are social beliefs? Social beliefs are defined as enduring beliefs shared by society members with contents that are perceived by society members as characterizing their society. Nile Valley people and West Africans shared a lot of common beliefs. For instance, their belief in afterlife is quite identical as we've seen earlier. They both believed in the equality of the genders and their complementarity, something that was characteristic of African peoples even in antiquity. Both male and female were important and were well represented in every level of the society, even at the highest level. This can be clearly observed in the mythology and cosmogony of these peoples of Africa, whereby both a male and a female were created at the same time to be the ancestors of humanity, or the emphasis on the complementary role of male and female in the creation of the universe. They did not believe a woman was inferior to a man, unlike in many ancient societies such as Mesopotamia or Greece. The Nile Valley people and West Africans also both believed their ancestors could interact with the gods in their favor and have an influence on the physical world. Another characteristic belief of these societies of Africa, they both believed in the divinity of their kings, as we saw earlier. Another characteristic of Kemites and Kushite society was the belief in Totemism. Here I will just quote directly from the work of the African anthropologist, historian, Egyptologist, chemist Dr. Shekanta Diop. In his book, From Tribe to Empire, Moret had stressed the essentially totemic character of Egyptian society. His thesis was subsequently opposed, almost as if it were feared that grave consequences would inevitably result from this. As a matter of fact, Fraser was categorical on the origin of totemism. He insisted that it is found only in colored populations. There was no way to accept his thesis if one hoped to demonstrate the white origin of Egyptian civilization. So one tried to deny Egyptian totemism while seeking traces of it in so-called white populations such as the Berber and Tuareg. The zeal with which it was sought in those two groups proves that if the search had been successful, there would have no longer been any doubt about Egyptian totemism. But the attempt failed. Arnold van Gennep, 1873 to 1957, could not detect any Berber totemism. Quite edifying, isn't it? Now today, no serious Egyptologist can deny the totemic nature of Kemet culture, a cultural belief that cannot be found in Mesopotamia or in the Mediterranean. But where do we find this belief in the proximity of the Nile Valley? In Africa south of the Sahara. Yet another belief that survived the Green Sahara era, proving yet again that the Nile Valley people shared a common culture in the past with their West African brothers and other Africans in general, meaning they were once one people. This belief in totemism is present pretty much in all parts of Africa south of the Sahara. Yet some will vainly try to say that there is no link between Central Africans and West Africans and Nile Valley people. Totemic culture was very present and still is present in traditional West African societies despite the diversity of the region. There are so many other beliefs that I could mention here, but we don't have enough time. We need to move on to customs. So customs, what are customs? Customs are a traditional and widely accepted way of behaving or doing something that is specific to a particular society, place, or time. Here, a very telling custom the Nile Valley people and West Africans share is the practice of circumcision and excision. Excision. Yes, I know excision is a painful practice to women. I'm not condoning it, I'm just saying our people practice this. Anyhow, this practice, although present in the Semitic world, had its origins in Africa. Both Strabo and Herodotus tell us that circumcision originated in Kemet. Herodotus says, quote, "My own conjectures were founded first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly amounts to but little, since several other nations are so too, but further, and more especially on the circumstances that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest times. The Phoenicians and Assyrians of Palestine themselves confess that they learned the custom of the Egyptians, and the Syrians who dwell about the rivers, Thermodon and Parthenius, as well as their neighbors the Macronians, say that they have recently adopted it from the Colchians. Now these are the only nations who use circumcision, and it is plain that they all emanate herein the Egyptians." It is clear Mediterranean and Western Asian people got this practice from Africa in Kemet, a clear example of cultural diffusion by proximity. Then Strabo tells us the following. The Egyptians are especially careful in raising all the children and circumcise the boys and even the girls, a custom common to the Jews, a people originally from Egypt, as we observed when we discussed that subject. The Jews were originally from where?
Isn't this getting to be interesting? It is, yes.
Anyhow, even in the Semitic world, the practice of circumcision is the result of having lived in Kemet. To better understand this, I will quote again directly from the research of the great Dr. Kemet and West. Thus, we can understand why the Semites practice circumcision despite the fact that their traditions present no valid justification for it. The weakness of the argument in Genesis is typical. God asked Abraham and later Moses to be circumcised as a sign of a covenant with him, without explaining how circumcision, considered from the standpoint of Jewish tradition, can lead to the notion of an alliance. This is all the more curious because Abraham was allegedly circumcised at the age of 90. In Egypt, he married a Negro woman, Hagar, mother of Ismail, the biblical ancestor of the second Semitic branch, the Arabs. What should be noted in these legendary tales is the idea that circumcision was introduced among the Semites only as a result of contact with the black world, which conforms to the testimony of Herodotus. This is yet another example of cultural diffusion by direct contact, as opposed to survived cultural items that points to a common origin. Dr. Kemet and West continues by illustrating how circumcision and excision only find an interpretation integrated in a general explanation of the universe in African societies. This is an important aspect because human societies have a mythical explanation to explain the origin of certain of their practices that can be found in their society. Because human gotta explain everything. Why do you sit? Well, because the gods came with chairs. Or no, because you need to sit down or you'll be tired. Anyway, hence Dr. Diop tells us the following in his book, The African Origin of Civilization. Quote, only among blacks does circumcision find an interpretation integrated in a general explanation of the universe. In other words, a cosmogony. Specifically, the Dogon cosmogony that Marcel Griol reports. In Dieu d'eau, he reminds us that to make sense, circumcision must be accompanied by excision. These two operations remove something female from the male and something male from the female. To the archaic mentality, such an operation is intended to fortify the dominant character of a single sex in a given human being. According to the Dogon cosmogony, a newborn baby is to a certain extent androgynous like the first god. Here, Dr. Diop is quoting directly from the work of Marcel Griol, French anthropologist. So long as it retains its foreskin and clitoris, indication of the sex opposite to the apparent sex, masculinity and femininity have equal strength. Thus, it is not accurate to compare the uncircumcised to a woman, like a girl on whom excision has not been performed. He is both male and female. If this indecision about his sex were allowed to continue, he or she would have no interest in procreation. These, then, are the various reasons for circumcision and excision. The need to rid the child of an evil force, the need for him or her to pay a debt of blood and to turn definitely towards one sex. Now Dr. Diop stopped quoting from Marcel Griol. Now this is Dr. Diop speaking. For this explanation of circumcision to be valid, divine androgyny, the traditional cause of this practice in African society, must also have existed in Egyptian society. Only then can we be justified in identifying the ritual causes of circumcision among the Egyptians and in the rest of Black Africa. Always edifying to read this brilliant man. See how scientifical that was? See how critical it was? As we saw earlier, both the Nile Valley Supreme Being, Amon, and the West African Supreme Being, Olodumare, Rog, Nyakupon, etc. are androgynous. This is yet another cultural connection the Nile Valley and West Africa share. Let's keep going. Now on to norms. Social norms. Social norms are shared standards of acceptable behavior by groups. Here we are solely going to focus on gender, that is, how male and female were treated in society and expected to act according to societal standards. How many genders are there?
How many genders are there?
I don't know. I just got here.
So when you compare how men and women were treated in Kemet and Kush and West Africa, or the rest of Africa in general, it shows you again that these people are indeed related. Let's see what they say of the treatment of women in Kemet. In a study done by Radra Khalil et al. 2017, the following is said. Unlike other ancient societies, women in ancient Egypt had high degree of equal opportunity and freedom. Nardo 2004. Ancient Egyptians, women and men, were firmly equal. Interestingly, ancient sources indicate that women were qualified to sue and obtain contracts incorporating any lawful settlements, such as marriage, separation, property, and jobs. Some of these rights are not given to women in modern-day Egypt. Furthermore, the historian Herodotus witnessed an exceptional display of humanity and equality in ancient Egypt that was not present in other ancient societies. The study then goes on to say the following. Other recorded occupations of ancient Egyptian women were hair specialists, supervisors of the wig workshop, treasurers, writers, songstresses, weavers, dancers, musicians, grievers, priestess, and even directors of imperial kingdom. One such occupation was that of judge and vizier or vizier to the pharaoh. This position was held by a woman called Nebet of the Old Kingdom. The vizier was the most capable individual after the Lord Pharaoh, going about as his correct handman. Unlike other societies, ancient Egyptian women were not subservient to men, were able to choose suitable men for a wedding, and were also able to separate from their husbands. Ancient Egyptian women had the right to education. From the age of 4, they were trained in instructive establishments where they were taught science, geometry, and the essentials of hieroglyphic and conversational hierarchic. So the social standing of Kemite women is better than modern-day Egyptian women. Wonder why that is. Cultural shift. Anyway, so you see, ancient Egyptian women could hold positions of power. A treasurer of the kingdom, of a priesthood, of a temple. Come on, they could be writers. In Europe, women couldn't be writers in the 1840s, guys. Jane Austen, she had to hide herself. A brilliant writer, love her stories, right? Pride and Prejudice, Emma. But she had to hide herself because she was a woman. She couldn't write. But in Kemet, thousands of years ago, they allowed women to write because they are human beings. They have brains. Anyhow, get heated on this issue. I have many sisters. Okay, let's go. This has been known in Egyptology for a long time. Yet, some would still try to paint ancient Kemet as a misogynistic culture.
Bruh.
And for Kush, we don't even need to prove anything here. The Kushites were very matriarchal, and this was acknowledged by both ancient and modern historians. Women had a high standard in Kushite society as well, higher than Kemet even, because it was often the case that in Kush, a woman was the leader, the full leader with full power and full titles. These are the Kandake, also known as the Candace. It's Kandake. They ruled as leaders and men were willing to follow them. People were willing to follow them. Unlike other cultures, in Kemet and Kush, it was normal for a woman to be in a high position in the society. Now, was this the norm in West Africa too? In pre-colonial times and pre-Islamic West Africa? Yes, it very much was. Here is what the research of the American anthropologist Nyara Sudarkasa tells us about the position of women in pre-colonial West African societies. Quote, "From my own readings on Africa and my research among the Yoruba in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, it appears that except for the highly Islamized societies in sub-Saharan Africa, in this part of the world, more than any other, in pre-colonial times, women were conspicuous in high places. They were queen mothers, queen sisters, princesses, chiefs, and holders of other offices in towns and villages, occasionally warriors, and in one well-known case, that of the Lovedu, the supreme monarch. Furthermore, it was almost invariably the case that African women were conspicuous in the economic life of their societies, being involved in farming, trade, and craft production." You heard it. African women could be chiefs of a village. A chief of a village. That's like the mayor of a small town. In ancient times, African women being part of the economic life of their nation is still very much practiced today. You go to the market in Africa, you find many women there. It's women who dominate that area. Anyway, she mentions the Lovedu people. Who are they? The Lovedu or Lobedu are a southern African people whose traditional supreme ruler was to be a woman, not a man, a woman. These were known as the Rain Queens. Dr. Nyara Sudarkasa did her research, and it is clear the woman in West Africa and Africa in general was not viewed as inferior to the man or as his subservient, just as in Kemet and Kush. What about the Mediterranean region? Well, just look today. No, but about the ancient world of the Mediterranean region and the Western Asia. We look at Mesopotamia, for example, where the culture of Kemet supposedly originated. Let's see what the experts say on this issue. In general, men worked outside the home while women stayed at home, raising their children and taking care of the household. There were exceptions to the norm. For instance, we know of female weavers and female quote-unquote bartenders who not only sold beer but also offered small loans. In all these cases, however, women were still allotted less freedom than men. Female weavers received less pay in grain rations than their male counterparts. The choices of profession were limited for women. In terms of actual laws, the punishment for various crimes, including adultery, were generally much harsher for women than for men. It was much more difficult for a woman to obtain a divorce than for a man. See, there were exceptions to the norm. The norm was that women stay at home, raise children. This is again another example of the striking differences between Kemet and the Near East, the so-called Near East, which I like to call Western Asia, as opposed to the very strong similarities or the very identical practices the Kemites had with their African brothers further south. Let's carry on to the next point. 3. Art and crafts. First, let's define these terms. What is art? Art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in visual form such as paintings or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. And a craft is an activity involving skill in making things by hand. While art doesn't vary too much across cultures, most people make sculptures and paintings and music, there are certain eerie similarities in the way Nile Valley people make their art and the way West Africans make theirs. If we look at sculpture, for instance, we can notice that both the Nile Valley people and West Africans incorporate certain common elements such as full lips, broad noses, subnasal prognatism, and so on. The way they represent hair is also very similar, a bit like when they represent hair in ancient Greece and hair in ancient Rome. It's very similar. Check out this image of Pharaoh Menkaura and a West African statue from Benin. See how the hair is similarly represented? It's the same hairstyle, straight lines going down, and the hair is placed in a row. So they're basically short locks that you're seeing on the Kemite pharaoh and this West African man. The similarity of hair representation in sculpture speaks volume. Look at this other picture of Nesut and Tef from the previous video we saw of the Middle Kingdom and the Kushite men. They're both wearing short locks. Then you see the difference in the hair representation of the Roman. So if the Egyptians were really Mediterranean people, hence they had hair like most Mediterranean people, like the Moroccans or the Libyans or the Arabs, so straight silk hair, this is the way the hair would have been represented, but this is not what you see. See how different that looks? See how differently different it is?
Something differently different to the eye. Everybody's so creative.
Love that woman. Shout outs to her. Then look at these other sculptures from West Africa compared to those of Kemet. Special thanks to the subscriber Mansa Musa for the following images. Thank you so much for your great collection. This guy is out there collecting pictures, and then one day just sent me all these pictures and I was like, wow, thank you so much. Now we have all these images to see. And guys, look at this. I don't know if YouTube is gonna censor this. Hopefully they don't, because these are sculptures, man. I'm gonna try to put something on top, but you know what it is. I'm just gonna leave the Kemite one, but the other ones I'm gonna remove because they're pretty graphic. Anyway, you see the same representation of the phallus, yes, Kemet, West Africa. You have Mali, Benin, they represent the phallus in the same way as the Kemite did. And look at this statue from Mali with the crossed arms like that. That's the position of Kemite mummies. Another similarity. Let's keep going. Now look at these other statues. We have a Ghanaian statue holding a staff. It's pretty much the same as the Kemite statue holding a staff as well, with an animal or something representing it. These are totems. You see, this one, his totem is a cat and he's holding it as heraldry. Then when you look at the normal palette, there is the same kind of heraldry they're carrying for the Nesut, the first Nesut of Kemet, that is normal. Very interesting similarities. Then you have similarity in cloth making, art. Look at that. Now guys, this is the exact same pattern you see on the Kente from the Akan people, Ghana. Yo, come on. And look at the skin color on the sarcophagus. And then you compare it to the skin color of the man wearing the Kente, the beautiful Kente. We already know they were black people. You know this. Anyway, then you look at another art form, martial arts. My favorite thing. I love martial arts, guys. Now you have these African martial arts still found in West Africa today. You find these huge ass wrestlers with big legs and big arms. Yo, these guys are quite awesome. Then you find the same practice in Kemet. There is a video Mr. Imhotep posted of a documentary made by the scholar Basil Davidson, I think. He was comparing Kushite wrestling, which is the exact same way as the West African wrestling practice. He was comparing the moves, and you saw all the moves from the hieroglyphic. You saw it in the Sudan, and you can see it in West Africa right now. Compare the image, guys. It's pretty telling. Then we have this other image, color schemes in Kemet. The color scheme in Kemet and West Africa is also similar similar. You see the way this woman in Cote d'Ivoire is drawn with a color black. Then her child is drawn with the color yellow to depict his light skin. I mentioned this in a previous video that you can go check out on my channel. Anyway, then you see the same being done in Kemet. The yellow skin is not to show, oh no, she was working inside, or it's a metaphorical representation to a womanhood.
You serious?
Most often, in natural settings of the paintings, like this one here you see, the coloration depicts skin tone. Anyway, we go to the Fawn people and the Kemites. Same coloration scheme. So the art again, those eerie similarities I spoke about, full lips, some nasal prognatism and all that, and the coloration scheme, right? Then you have this image of the Baule and the Kemites. Then you have the Yoruba, same coloration scheme. Then we move on to these images, the Akan people again using the same reddish brown color to depict the skin of their people in sculpture. And then you have the same in Kemet. Then you compare Kemet, Yoruba, using the very same coloration on the wood. Then you compare in Sudan, Kush, the undeniably black people of the ancient world. They have the same coloration as the Kemites on paintings, on wall paintings. I have done this comparison so many times, it's quite undisputable. Then you have this in Nigeria again, the same coloration being used as in Kemet. You can see for yourself, the coloration scheme speaks for itself. Another very telling thing is the fact that certain West African musical instruments are the same as those of Kemet. For instance, we have the West African Molo lute. Look at the Molo lute. It is identical to this Kemite lute from ancient times, and these are made in a very similar fashion. Yes, the stick is longer in Kemet, but look at the way the string is attached to the stick, to the neck of the lute, with a rope tied around it. It's crazy. Then you have the body of the lute, and both of them have like 2 strings. You can't make this up. Then, to prove to you that this is a Kemite lute, we have it being depicted on Kemite wall paintings. Here is the Kemite lute being played by this black man of Kemet that you see, and then we have a depiction of West Africans being drawn by European travelers in the past playing the same lute.
Isn't this getting to be interesting? It is, yes.
Then we have King Tutankhamun's stool, which looks very much like an Ashanti royal stool. See how it looks bent over there? Then look at how the Ashanti made royal stools for their kings. It's pretty much the same design. Then you have this royal chair from the Ashanti people, and then you compare it to the design of the Kemite one. The feet, the way they cross, guys. Anyway. Then, one very telling thing is the combs found in Kemet and the combs found in West Africa. Look at these. These pre-dynastic combs are clearly Afro combs. And these are more than 5,000 years old combs. And they're still looking Afro because the craft must have been much more detailed and better than this one back in, ancient time. But then you compare them to these West African combs. These are Ashanti combs. Compare the designs. First of all, these are clearly Afro combs for the purpose of combing Afro hair or tropical hair texture, or your so-called kinky hair texture for lack of a better term. See the design on top? See how they designed their combs in the exact same way? They didn't just make any comb just like simple design, flat top. No, they designed it. They put some care into it. They decorated it. The same was happening in pre-dynastic Kemet. Yet they will still deny the very African nature of Kemite culture. Why did they make African combs if they didn't have Afro hair? Please make that make sense. The pre-dynastic combs of Kemet and those of West Africa show a survived cultural item that they most likely both used in the Green Sahara. Can you find these same survived items in Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean? The answer is no. Let's move on to the last point, capabilities. 4. Capabilities. Here is where the detractors like to come and say,
well, there is nothing in black African people's culture that suggests that they could have been the builders of such a complex and intricate civilization such as ancient Egypt.
When I started making videos on this issue, I got this sort of comment pretty much every day. Like really, Ario 4 would know what he asked me. I told him I will destroy his ignorant statement in a future video. Well, here we are, Ario. You ready for it? And there is also this fellow who said the following.
Name me one sub-Saharan mathematician, engineer, one sub-Saharan literary work. There is absolutely none in the entire continent.
You serious?
Thank you, Alexander, for the content you just gave us. Wow. See what I was talking about? This truly screams ignorance of African history and blatant racist beliefs. Hence, in this segment, we will proceed to debunk and obliterate these racist beliefs. First, let's define what we mean by capabilities in sociology. Social capabilities are activities, information, knowledge, procedures, processes, skills, systems, technologies, or unique adaptive features. When we look at what West Africans knew and were capable of, we find it hard to argue that they and the Nile Valley people were part of the same culture. We start with architecture. Architecture is a domain where Eurocentric detractors love to say that there is no stone construction or architectural works that remotely resemble that of the Nile Valley. Let's see if reality supports this view. We first go back to the pre-dynastic period of the Nile Valley civilizations. Archaeology informs us that Nile Valley civilizations built round-shaped structures made of mud with a thatch for a roof. In plain terms, they were building mud huts to live in, like any other African people south of the Sahara. This shows the similarity in thinking of these African peoples and their similar adaptive abilities. They first start with building mud huts, then when they develop a strong and stable society and a complex political system and economic system, they then go on to invest in more durable materials and more complex constructions. We saw this in Kemet and Kush, and the same occurred in West Africa, with the oldest example of these complex constructions being at Dar-Tichet in modern days Mauritania. This is the oldest West African civilization that we know of. It dates back to 2200 BC, around the time of Old Kingdom Kemet. These Dar-Tichet ruins are ruins that still stand more than 4,000 years later, and they are made of stone. If you hadn't noticed, Ario and his fellas, this is stone. Just look in front of you. Look at these images. Guys, stone structures, stone houses all over the place 4,000 years ago. Then we fast forward to 1500 AD. We find in West Africa a great pyramid-like feat, which are the great city walls of Benin. These walls were so numerous and well built that they are said to be longer than the Great Wall of China and to have taken more material than the Great Pyramid of Khufu. That is out of pocket, guys. Here is what the English science writer Fred Pierce had to say about it. They extend the Benin walls for some 6,000 kilometers in all, in a mosaic of more than 500 interconnected settlement boundaries. They covered 2,500 square miles, 6,500 square kilometers for the rest of the world, and were all dug by the Edo people. In all, they are 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. They took an estimated 150 million hours of digging to construct and are perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet. This is from his article African Queen in the New Science magazine of the UK. Jealous people will say we're making this up. There is archaeological work for this. Remnants of the walls can still be found in Nigeria today.
By the way, Nigerians, you need to keep these walls properly, or I am coming for your ass. I'm dead serious.
Anyway, also there are oral historical accounts of their presence and accounts of European travelers from the 1500s attesting to their presence. This shows you again that Africans south of the Sahara were very capable of doing the kind of gargantuan work that we find in the Nile Valley. The walls of Benin and the surrounding areas were described as, and I quote, the world's largest earthworks carried out prior to mechanical era by the Guinness Book of Records. This is what happens when Africans are left alone to mind their own business and do their own thing. They give you structures that are beyond comprehension, like the Great Zimbabwe or the Great Walls of Benin or the Pyramids of Giza. Some of their kings and queens request the most daunting tasks from their subjects, and they just proceed, since both these people believed in the divine nature of their kings and queens. This is why you see these kind of gargantuan construction works that are beyond comprehension in Africa. Anyhow, we go to medicine. When you look at medicinal knowledge from West African Kemet, both West Africans and Nile Valley people were very proficient in the medical field, with the Kemites being the first to have diagnosed a cancer in human history. The West Africans seem to have invented the technique of inoculation, all on their own. The Kemites were known to practice medicine accompanied with certain spells or prayers or incantations, until the practice was dropped in later periods to remain strictly with the scientific aspect. But still, you could still find remnants of this incantation spiritual aspect to it. This is still very much the case with our traditional doctors who mix incantations with their medical knowledge. Then we go to mathematics and astronomy. In these fields, we find again eerie similarities between West Africa and the Nile Valley. The most intriguing similarity is the fact that both the Dogon people of West Africa and the Kemites were able to locate the dwarf sister star of Sirius A, that is Sirius B of the Sirius system. Sirius B is invisible to the naked eye, and the Kemites and the Dogon people managed to locate it and draw an accurate system. Look at these images on the screen of the Dogon system and the modern scientific system of the Sirius system. Very identical, according to the research of Marcel Griol. And what is most interesting is that the Dogon people and the Kemite both based their calendars on this knowledge. They based their calendars and counting days, counting years on this knowledge of Sirius B. Also, did I mention that the Dogon people's supreme being was named Ama? It is very reminiscent of Amon. Anyhow, West Africans and Africans in general were very proficient in astronomy. Both were aware that the Earth was a sphere, that it went around the Sun and not the reverse, and that there were many other planets in our solar system. And then we go to mathematical knowledge. Here again, we see that African peoples share a common cultural background in this field. Math in Kemet and Kush was the best in the ancient world. You can't even debate that it's true. Now, when we look at West African cultures and their mathematical traditions, we can only see another cultural similarity here. For instance, Yoruba Ifa divination is a complex mathematical algorithm. I'm sure the mathematical genius who invented it must have been smirking while he told his people he could predict future events with his complex mathematical formula that he called divination. Anyway, that's just a little hypothesis I have. Then we have the fact that West Africans are known to be among the best at mental calculation in the world. This is evidenced by the presence of men like Thomas Fuller, an American slave from West Africa who could calculate the number of seconds a man of 70 years, 17 days and 12 hours had lived. And this he did under 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I'm not kidding here. Go research about Thomas Fuller. You will see his incredible calculation capacities. You will be stunned. Under 2 minutes? Can you try that right now? Pause the video. Do it under 2 minutes. I tried. It took me 10 minutes on paper. 10 minutes on paper. And I used the calculator. See how the modern world has messed us up? Our ancestors could do these kind of calculations mentally. And now imagine doing it mentally under 2 minutes. This is out of pocket, guys. Thomas Fuller is known to this day as the greatest human mental calculator that has ever existed. Thomas Fuller is believed to be from West Africa. Then we have the little beautiful Faith Odunsi, a Nigerian math genius who has won the Global Open Mathematics competition at age 15 and set a record by correctly answering 19 questions in 60 seconds. Within 60 seconds. The tradition continues. Even European travelers and traders of the 15th century noticed that West Africans were particularly good at mental calculation. They noticed that West Africans would often find the right answer quicker than their European counterparts, who did their calculations with pen and paper. And what's funnier is that the West Africans would even be quick to correct the mistakes of the Europeans who did their calculations on paper. They'll be like, no, you made a mistake there, and the Europeans go back and redo the calculation and damn.
That was legitness. Yeah, it was, huh?
Then we look at clothing. Both the West Africans and Nile Valley people don't cover their torsos. This is evidence of the same adaptive features of tropical African people. With their high amounts of melanin, protection from the sun is not a must. Actually, their melanin would thank them for it. Hence, they made clothes that just covers the lower body. Can you find this adaptive feature in, say, Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean? No, you can't. Finally, let's look at some pictures I stole from Mr. Imhotep's channel. Look at this image. This clearly shows you common cultural knowledge and procedure. Kemite women carried their goods like African women do today. Look at this picture. It's pretty telling. Then we have this image of some Kemites cooking. Let me just read what Mr. Imhotep said. The mortar and pestle is a symbol of the traditional African kitchen, a versatile tool that can be compared to a blender or food processor all in one. It holds a sacred place in many African countries, and it is not just a tool, but also has a cultural and spiritual significance. As we can see, it was also a vital instrument in the kitchens of ancient Kemet, a true African civilization. Quite edifying. Shoutouts to Mr. Imhotep for his amazing contributions. I love that he said a blender and a food processor all in one. I mean, we got one at home right now. Here in my home in Congo, we have one. I grew up with one. When we make that pondu, you gotta use that one. It's the best way, according to our mothers. Now, the younger generation wants to use a blender, but our mothers prefer the old way, the traditional way, that goes back thousands of years, more than 5,000 years back. I'm even willing to say 6,000 years back, or even 7, because in pre-dynastic times, they must have been using these. Anyway, let's continue. This again shows strong similarity between these cultures. Cultural technology, knowledge, and procedure, very much similar. This is why the anthropologists said that Kemite culture was very African in nature. Even during the Cairo Symposium they said this. Then I have some other images I stole.
Or
Oh my God!
This time from the King's Monologue video on African headrests. Look at these pictures. This is a headrest from West Africa, the Yoruba people. And now, this is a headrest from ancient Kemet. You can see the Medune Ter at the bottom. This can be found throughout Africa. So these are commonly known as the African pillars. Shoutouts to the King's Monologue for his great contributions as well. Again, showcasing the very African nature of Kemetic culture. Same technology, same way of thinking, same knowledge, same culture, same people. You can't deny the common cultural background of these people. It is simply illogical and in bad faith to do so at this point. Can you find this technology in ancient Mesopotamia, for instance? No, you can't. The Mesopotamians used to make pillars with stone, and the design is very different. Alright guys, this was quite lengthy, but I enjoyed compiling this evidence. I enjoyed while I was recording the script. I enjoyed while I was editing, and I hope you too enjoyed this video and this compilation of information. Now, I hope you better understand when we say that a lot of the cultural elements of Kemet originated further within the African continent among the tropical African people, the Black African ancestors. Kemite and Kushite culture is African culture at its apex. After this, there can be little doubt that West Africans and ancient Nile Valley people are indeed related, and this culturally, genetically, and linguistically. In the next part of this series, we're going to explore the cultural similarities between the ancient Nile Valley civilizations and East Africans. So stay tuned for that one. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and share the video with as many people as you possibly can. And guys, I opened a Patreon. If you want to see some exclusive content that I made on there or earlier releases of my videos, please join me on Patreon. I'll be happy to see you there. If you're looking for the third part of looking at the pharaohs of Kemet, look no further than the Patreon. I'm gonna release it later on YouTube, but since you did not reach the like goal that I asked for, you have to go to Patreon first. Alright guys, that's it for this video, and see you in the next one. Peace.